All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Pablo Torres from Pablo Wealth Talks. Pablo is also a good friend and a partner. And so I am really excited to be here with you, Pablo.
I'm excited too, Angela. Thanks for having me. I have so much appreciation for you for everything that you're doing. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you this morning.
Awesome, awesome. And Pablo is and his organization, which I'll just position as more of a movement, is really focused on financial literacy and creating generational wealth, which I am really excited to kind of intersect our worlds here because I think this is a key element that organizations should be thinking about right now. So I will bounce it to you just to do an intro. Tell us who you are, what you do, but also what is the impact you're looking to make on the world.
Yeah, Angela, I whenever people ask me that, I always feel like what does the perfect response sound like? But it's just because a lot of the work that I am doing right now is really impacting people's lives from a financial standpoint. But also it really comes back down to the personal. So uh, the conversations that I have with people is really more specific around financial literacy, what you need to learn, how stuff works in terms of the wealth that you are looking to accumulate and grow. So for me at the core, Angela, it's I founded Pablo Wealth Talks. It's just advocacy to people. It's letting people be comfortable in their own skin about talking money and talking finances because it could be a very scary conversation. And so I founded Pablo Wealth Talks, Angela, to be an advocate to people so that they could feel like, hey, I have a resource that is available to me to have this discussion around building wealth. So for me, I was sharing this with you right before we started, but there's this picture here right on top of my head, and I don't know how things just work out, but they do. My This is a picture that was taken here in the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago, and my dad, who is also named Pablo Torres, so I'm junior. He was one of the co-founders of an organization in this exact building, right across the street from where I'm located. And so he founded a labor movement union for immigrants back in the 70s to have the rights of working at CTA or having government jobs, because back then a lot of Latino, specifically Mexican, community didn't have any really rights there. So to have a job. So for me, it's just kind of interesting how things come full circle. I know it's a long-winded answer, Angela, but for me, there's just a lot of good energy with being here today, having my dad, be there right across the street, being as one of the founders, and this is one of the awards that he was, and we have a conference room in the back where I was planning on setting up, but it just worked out where this office is available and it has my dad's stuff all over it. So it's pretty amazing. So yeah, things are coming full circle, Angela.
Yeah, what a full circle moment. And I want to kind of start to get into this conversation around advocacy around this work because I think generally when you think about financial literacy, you think about the usual like 401ks and some of the basics. But, I did want to kind of talk about why this is so important for especially Black and Brown communities, because I'll just speak from experience. Nobody taught me about financial literacy. It's not a part of our core curriculum when it comes to education. And, it wasn't a part of, it wasn't when it comes to underrepresented groups, it's just not a part of how we grow up or even talk about these things. And that's a huge barrier to things like generational wealth and building generational wealth in communities that are already lacking. So tell us more about your perspective on that.
I mean, you're right on. I mean, you're right on the money. Um, and Angela, I feel the same way. You know, I I've realized early on in my career, outside of Pablo Wealth Talks, I do financial planning for a living, but for me, I just realized that these are just conversations we just don't really have growing up, and there's specifically in the Black and Brown communities and in the inner cities, and marginalized communities. I think we just are always in survival mode, right? And whether that's trying to always wing it, figure it out, make sure there's food on the table, but I think if we just kind of take a step back, I don't even think we know what creating generational wealth is, right? Just at the core, like what is that exactly? How can we transfer the wealth that our parents built or our grandparents built and transition that over to the next generation and so forth. And I think we hear it and we just know it exists, but what does that actually look like, right? And for me, I think that's just like a big motivator for me to help people understand like what that actually is, and number one, just being educated around it. I think there's just a core missing piece in just education altogether in this country, with just like finances. So for me, Angela, that's like for me really important to have that conversation, have the tough conversation around creating wealth, talking money, because it's just something that we're not used to your point. And maybe it could be for a number of reasons. It could be a trauma that maybe we have seen or have gone through. It could be education. Maybe we're just not exposed to the resources like other communities may be having access to. Uh, so everyone has their story, but I think just traditionally the Black and Brown community, there's just like still a big void. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on as we just have the conversation. I really want to dive into like what the wealth gap is looking like right now, what is our purchasing power as a Black and Brown community. Those are things I like to share a ton with people just to give them some perspective that yeah, we may not have the knowledge per se, but we know how to create wealth. We know how to make money. We know how to really roll up our sleeves and go to work. But now it's just how can we bridge that gap? So there's a plan in place, you're educated, and what can we do to make sure that the next generation can take that over and continue that legacy building.
Yeah, and I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about the wealth gap and the disparity, just to put things into perspective.
Yeah, so I think more than ever, the wealth gap is pretty incredible how apart, how the wealthy in this country own the wealth in this country. So, the top 1% in this country, right, owned 90% of the wealth. So let's think about that, right? The top 1% own 90% of that wealth, whether that's, uh, you know, assets like real estate, assets like hedge funds and 401ks and all these just ginormous platforms of assets that are allowing to build that wealth. But to me, what's happening with the remaining 10%? Right? So that 10% now is spread out through the lower and middle class, right? And so now things are getting a lot tougher for the lower and middle class because the gap just continues to grow, and the wealthier become wealthier. You probably have heard this, but the poor become more poor, and some of those things could be out of our control, Angela, because we just don't know what we don't know. But if we just start taking the right steps with educating ourselves, listening to podcasts just like this one, and really just understanding what are some different educational resources that we can listen to outside of the traditional school system that's going to help us grow our wealth. So for me, our purchasing power is pretty incredible. You know, I did a talk not too long ago, Angela, and here in Pilsen at Semillas. Shout out to Semillas if they're listening. They're great. I mean, we did a talk there together, Angela, for our first one. But I shared the purchasing power of the African American community, and I shared the purchasing power of the Asian American community. I shared also for the Latino community, and we are at a point where I think things are starting to now blossom with our generation. Angela, we're realizing what power we actually have, and our purchasing power is pretty incredible. We're $1 trillion purchasing power community combined. And so now if we look at that and we say, well, how can we incorporate building wealth? It's just more of like a mental switch and just like of awareness of what we need to do. And we just have to, be open minded to invest into ourselves, invest into our own goals, and how do we learn from what's happening with the wealth gap, and
Mm.
make that a little bit closer so that we can slowly start working towards decreasing it. So I think it's a big key takeaway is understanding what the wealth gap is, understanding our purchasing power, right? And now how can we take a step back and say, okay, what do we need to do to help reduce that in the country and just within our own households?
Yeah, it just strikes me that you talk about the top 1% and how underrepresented. I mean, we know who those top 1%, what they look like, right? We know they don't look like us necessarily. And then you talk about the purchasing power of Black and Brown people and communities. And first of all, that what I'm sensing is there's a huge opportunity, but there is a gap. And I think sometimes, we hear people kind of dismiss these things, right? Like there is no gap, there is no racism, there is no issue with the system. But what you just said is a very clear statistic that tells us that we have an issue. And I think what we're seeing is, again, an opportunity, but how do we educate so people can take advantage of those opportunities? And so I want to talk about kind of the organization's role in this because, this podcast is centered around social responsibility at work. And we're talking about a lot of things like um, systemic racism. We're talking about the systems as a whole. We're talking about the economy and how those work together. So, what can people who own businesses, who run organizations, what can they do to help with that gap?
Yeah, that's a great question, Angela, and I think companies are still trying to figure it out. I think people now are speaking up more than ever to. What I mean by people, the employees are now speaking up more than ever and saying we would love to have resources around financial literacy. That's going to help us save for retirement. What benefits do you have with your company that's going to allow me to save for my future? So I think the employees now have more power more than ever, Angela, to make a change within the organization, and I think that's super important to have the employees not shy away from that conversation when you are working at your employer or during the interview process. Maybe Angela, you can tell me more on like what that conversation could be or what questions we should be asking. But I do think that it's going to be a very important part of the interview process, understanding, what values the company has. But at the core of it, you still have to make sure that this company is the right fit for you financially as well, right? And I'm not talking about salary. I mean, that's important, but what is the platform? What is something that they have, whether it's having a 401k with a match, or if they're a small business, um, unfortunately, small business owners they struggle with employee retention. So what can they do as business owners to implement so that they're creating a positive culture? So some of the things that I think is a good idea is to have lunch and learns around financial literacy. You know, having a guest speaker come in and talk about how what's the home purchasing process like, how to build wealth with real estate. Having guest speakers come in and talk about different factors of creating wealth. So I think that's in like the extra, or like the icing on like trying to build culture where uh, the business owners could offer that to their employees. But I think more than ever, Angela, there needs to have there needs to be a system in place that's going to allow them to invest into their future. Whether that's profit sharing, there's stock options, there's your 401ks, there's so many different things that now are available. But I think where people are nervous, or they just fall a little behind by not actually being a part of those benefits. They just don't know what they are, right? And so it still comes back to education, right? It still comes back to like learning about what they should be doing.
Yeah, and I'll just, also add the point that there is a responsibility of the organization. So if you're not paying people living wages, for example, how do you expect them to be talking about financial literacy when they are in that survival mode that you talked about earlier? So if you're an organization that is employing people and you're not paying them a living wage, and then you add on, you hire Pablo Wealth Talks to come in and have a conversation about home ownership and real estate, you are not going to get the outcome you want because people are literally just trying to survive on the less than optimal salary that you're providing them. So I think there's an organizational responsibility to really take a long, hard look and make sure you're taking care of people and having the things available for them to actually build wealth. Because I think what we're going to see is people are finding other ways to build wealth. That's the gig economy. They're finding other opportunities to have multiple jobs so that they can achieve that. Because I think people are waking up to the fact, especially in underrepresented communities, that I need to have something for myself. And if my job is not providing that, then I'm going to build it. I'm going to make it happen. So I love what you're saying, and I think that organizations, like there are way too many organizations out there that are not paying people living wages, or taking care of people so that they don't have to worry about just being in survival mode.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit it right on the head, Angela. I think we have to make sure that our employers understand like what each employee deserves income wise, because let's just let's talk about what's happening right now in the economy, right? Inflation hasn't been this high in the last 40 years. We're having whispers about a recession, and even though technically we are in a recession because there's 2 quarters that have negative growth in the GDP, but it just hasn't been announced. So I think there's just a lot of things happening in the landscape of the economy where more than ever it's tough for small business owners to offer a high paying salary or high paying job because they're still trying to make ends meet from their own business. But once they start scaling up, or once now you enter the corporate space, I think now the employees have more leverage of like, hey, this is actually what I deserve. And to your point, Angela, like there's now so many side hustles that have been created since the pandemic that just because of inflation, the cost of living, cost of goods have gone up. We have really no choice but try to now go into like burnout phase, right? With like trying to figure out, I need to make ends meet. I need to make sure we have this figured out. And what's interesting, Angela, once you have it figured out and once things are starting to fall into place, I think that's where now you need to take a step back and say, okay, what's next, right? What do I do now to make sure I'm well positioned 5, 10, 20 years from now, right? And I think that's where having a conversation with having someone like you, having someone like me speak at an organization or speak in a community event, and we're just planting seeds. I think hopefully that could create an awareness of how important this stuff is to really invest into yourself.
Yeah, and you bring up a point about side hustles that I would love to just explore with you for a little bit here, because
Yeah.
there are a lot of organizations, a lot of leaders that I've talked to who do, like do not allow side hustles, right? So it's in their policies that says you cannot work any other job. And I personally, my own philosophy is, if the person within your organization is contributing and you're setting expectations and they're delivering on those expectations, why not allow or create that flexibility for someone to build wealth, especially if your organization cannot afford wealth building tools like a living, a livable salary or 401k. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've heard many different perspectives.
Um, I think it's unfair if organizations are saying, hey, you're not able to have, your side hustle because that, they still need to make sure they're providing for their family and making sure that they're planning ahead. And just from what I've learned and with my experience, Angela, I think mentorship has a big impact there with, understanding like why should we then do a side hustle? I think people are just unhappy with where they're at in their careers, not because the work that they do is not enjoyable, they're not they're passionate about, but maybe they're just not aligning with the company's values, or maybe the stay work from home shift in in like the workplace has changed recently, where now they're saying, well, I'm saving a ton of time and money working from home, and I'm actually able to do more, essentially. You get more of a I'm not sure if you've covered this before, Angie, but I see that people now are able to save money from traveling and commuting, saving money from eating out lunch or hanging out with coworkers for a happy hour after work. And so that's just some feedback that I've heard from people now saying, I have this extra money, but my true passion is really being an entrepreneur, right? And so my let me understand what that looks like. Let me start, pairing up with a mentor that has, their own business, and maybe just tag along and just learn about their business and learn about like what being a business owner is. And I feel that that is perfectly fine, that they should be allowed to have their own passion come into fruition. um, so
Yeah,
I,
I
I,
agree
I know, I
100%.
know, I know, I know legally there's some, by rules of laws, there's something that you can't have conflicts of interest. I mean, I get that 100%. So, I agree there that there's some careers that could possess a conflict. So you have to also be cautious there. But I would say right now there's so many solo and entrepreneurs that are being created on a daily basis, and I'm just, entrepreneurs, it has like, it's like a soft spot for me because just this is why me and you connect so well too. We're both running our own businesses, and I'm all for creating a side hustle if you're super passionate about it.
Yeah, and conflicts of interest aside, because I agree 100%. I think you have to protect your company, but I think what's missing from, kind of the naysayers around this is not realizing, I think, one, that the it's a non-monetary way. Providing flexibility to your team and your organization is a non-monetary way. You can not only provide an opportunity for them to build wealth, but there's also a ton of transferable skills that can be built that can contribute to your company while that person is building their business. Now, again, performance, you have to keep performance expectations high, right? That's what we do within organizations. We're clear about what the expectations are, but how you get those results should not matter. If you need to be in the office and you work on a assembly line, of course you need to be there physically. But if you're working in a knowledge type role where you are able to structure your day and your time and your energy in a way where you can produce a side hustle, I am all for the side hustle. So I think going back to your question about questions you should be asking when you're looking into an employer or a new organization or new opportunity. I think if you have a side hustle, I think you need to align with an organization that's going to allow you to build that wealth and be supportive of that. I know that's probably scary for some people, but I went through this process before I decided to start my own business. I worked for an organization that I was very clear with up front in the interview process. I said, I'm just going to be real with you. I'm building this business. I'll probably be here 2 years, and I will contribute noticeable, tangible monetary value to your organization in those 2 years. But after that, I'm going to be working for myself. But maybe I can consult for you, right? So having that open communication early on is important. And you would be surprised how many organizations are open to a situation like that. And then asking the question, how does this organization help their employees build wealth? That's a perfect interview question to ask, right? Because then they're going to mention the 401k, the salary. And if they can't mention those things and they don't align with your plan, then it might not be a good organization to work for, or the right organization to work for you.
Yeah, I love that. I love that question. What do you have in place that's going to allow me to build my wealth working for this company? What benefits do you have compared to, your competitor? And again, Angela, like I love what you're saying there, because the employees more now than ever have a lot more say in what those benefits should be. And I'm super grateful, and I've been blessed just these last couple of years for my business to continue to grow, because I'm advocating for my clients and making sure that they're making the best money decisions moving forward. But also in return, from what I've seen, people are changing jobs left and right in the last 5 years. Well, before it was collecting the pension, working there for 30 years, 30 plus years, maybe your grandparents or your parents, that, same with my dad, my mom, they worked for, a factory blue collar job for pretty much their whole lives to collect that pension, right? And they stayed there, and it was very different 30, 40, 50 years ago. Now, I think now we're more in control of understanding what do you have in place that's going to benefit me and my family, from a financial landscape. And it doesn't need to just be an hourly pay or a salary pay. Like, what does your work life balance look like? What does that culture look like? And I think that's where we're shifting a bit. Maybe the pandemic had a lot to do with that, Angela, where we're just taking a step back and saying, well, is it really all about the money? Right? Like, I'd like to enjoy some time off with my family, and don't feel like I have to have a 60-hour work week. So I guess I'm curious with just what you're seeing, Angela, with just the work that you've done. Like, how is that being viewed now, from an organization or leadership standpoint? And like, what tips are you sharing with people?
Yeah, good question. I think that money is a means to an end. And I think sometimes organizations, will look at like the salaries they're paid and be like, we're paying you well, but they're offering a toxic workplace and shitty leaders. And we have to remember that money is a means to an end. People use their money to spend that on their family, to support a lifestyle, to build generational wealth, to pay off bills and things that put them in a better position from a lifestyle perspective. So we have to stop just focusing on the number and start thinking about how are we creating equitable equal outcomes around wealth for people. And that takes some equitable treatment to really understand, what do people need? What kind of education do they need? What kind of opportunities do we need to open up for that? And I'm also noticing, um, I do some executive and board coaching, with boards as a whole, but also individuals. And a lot of the women and women of color, especially who I speak to, it's so interesting because I feel the same way. And I made an intentional like focus for 2023 is that wealth, money, people are scared to like um make that a value of theirs. Like, I will just say it out loud. I value money. Wealth is now one of my top values that I want to achieve. And I think, as women, especially women of color, we've been taught that you don't say those things. Like, actually, I felt kind of bad initially saying, like, I value money. And it's because we've been conditioned that way. And so that is also a barrier individually for people to be like, let's talk about money. Let's talk to my husband about how we need to be planning for the future. You can have that role within your household to value money. So those are just some things from an organizational, but then also an individual perspective that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I hear that loud and clear, and I think it's super important. It just reminds me, I'm not sure if we have the time, but I'll just kind of share a quick story. I had a side conversation with my brother-in-law at a family party, and and he's African American, and we both click really well, and we were just talking about just like what's happening with the economy. Like me and him, we're just like encyclopedias to each other. We're always like, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Or, and we were talking about how, Elon Musk, is taking over Twitter, and like just saw the stuff that's happening now, how they don't have any issues seeking and growing as much as possible. Like no one's questioning how much money, he's making, or how much. Like, yeah, there's gonna be the political side of it, of like, trying to hinder, what he's doing. But politics aside, I think just overall the landscape, their views of money are very different to us, where we're almost like, not gonna call it shy, but it's more, we're almost like afraid of making too much money, because what is that going to, I don't know, like culturally, how are our own people are going to view us? Are you going to view us as a sellout, or are you going to view us, oh, you're not from the hood anymore, or you're not from a certain side of town? So I think for us, we've always have been like trying to be more below the radar, to not make, to your point, make money a value. But I think if we take a step back, I don't think we should limit ourselves. We should normalize the conversation. We should actually make it at the top of the list, to be a priority, to also educate ourselves and educate our kids. Like, hey, let's talk about the value of money. It's a tool for sure, but it's super important. It's an important part of your tool belt, right? To success. So I wanted to share that, Angela, because we took a step back and we said, yeah, like
Mm.
we are always trying to, like, oh well, I'm making enough, or I have a nice home and I'm happy and I don't need. But when we take a step back and we're like, wait, we don't deserve that. I think we're just conditioned to think that way. And I think now if we just take the those lenses off of what we're used to seeing, and just like putting on a new vision of like the landscape of like, hey, let's max out our potential, and let's include money to be a part of that conversation.
And I think it gets back to that purchasing power that you mentioned early on, which the other thing I want to mention from an organizational perspective is, if you are an organization that is providing a service, selling a product, anybody listening to this podcast who's a business owner or is leading an organization, you have to understand that buying power from Black and Brown communities. And if you aren't involving somebody in your conversations at the boardroom, when you're creating products, when you're creating services, if you don't have that representation, that diversity, you are missing out. Like there is a business case behind this because, I mean, I think you quoted $1 trillion plus is on the table if you're not thinking about that diversity. And then also, I just to kind of like tie the bow on this, I think that we really have to consider the experiences of underrepresented groups within the workplace and how those groups think about wealth and kind of get out of this paradigm of I'm offering a salary, so we should be good. Think about your responsibility as an organization to create wealth, to close that gap. That is a great opportunity. If you're talking about DE&I, that is one actionable, sustainable, regenerative way to actually build wealth and equity over time. And you have that power as an organization to provide that depending on how many employees you have, and then they have families, right? And they contribute to communities, and that buying power, typically, especially women and women of color, that usually goes back to communities and other women, which is good for everybody.
Yeah, I think just what you're saying is so powerful. Where we could look at the wealth gap as, okay, this is what it is, and this is what the landscape looks like. But if we break it down to purchasing power, the African American community, and this is from 2020, rose to 1.6 trillion as a community in purchasing power. So the Latino community 1.9 trillion, and this is where I shared this in my last workshop. We the workshop was creating wealth through real estate. What does that look like? This home ownership, investing, just the landscape of what's happening now with the market. Is a good time to buy versus, we were having a healthy discussion, and the energy in the room was incredible. We had some great speakers. But this is where I thought was a wake up call for everyone. I shared what the wealth is. Right now, the white family household has $183,000 built in wealth. Average white family. The average black family has $23,000 in wealth. The Hispanic has $38,000 in wealth. So we have 76 to 80% less wealth than white families. And so, yes, we could see the landscape of the wealth gap, but I think now, to your point, Angela, we need to have a conversation at the table with organizations to say, hey, we have some very successful, black and brown owned businesses that should be a part of the initiative. Let's not just go straight to, these big box stores, and let's throw our money because we know that's just what we're used to. How about we create an initiative where there's actual, right, decision makers that are going to proactively build equity within, the black and brown community. So I think we're starting to see more of that, but I know there's still a big opportunity, and I think it ties back to financial literacy, in my opinion, because now at that point, the black and brown business owner can say, this is the wealth that we are looking to build. We're looking to build it through real estate. We're looking to build it into investing into the stock market. We're looking to build it through our business. And I think that's where, we could definitely make an impact, knowing that what should we be doing as a community, right?
Mm.
And as you can tell, I'm super passionate about having this conversation, Angela. But it goes back to your point, like these are some initiatives that I also agree that companies should really actively reach out to black and brown business owners, because there's so much there, so many great things happening.
I love it. Well, I mean, it kind of comes back to the point when you create equitable opportunities for people to participate in the economy, they will participate in the economy. So if you want a booming economy, create equity around wealth, create equity around generational wealth, and recognize that there is a gap. And that's kind of the main points that I'm pulling from this conversation. There's a lot of gems that you dropped, Pablo. So tell us where people can find you, and if they want to engage with you in Pablo Wealth Talks, how might they do that?
Yeah, so Angela, I appreciate you and everything that you're doing. So, I always want to say it publicly and between what we, our own side conversations, you're doing amazing with what you're doing,
Thank
with your
you.
podcast and all the work. So, you have a huge fan over here. So, for me, people can find me on Instagram. I have a Pablo Wealth Talks page. It was just founded earlier this year, and it's a grassroots effort. It's not there's no um, secret to the sauce. It's I like to call it like the FUBU philosophy, for us, by us, and it's the same. And I feel like that creates a lot of integrity with what we're doing. And it's called Pablo Wealth Talks. You can follow me there. You can send me a message there. I also run and own a financial planning business, but for me, my core right now is really advocating for financial literacy and having a conversation as a community, and culturally, like what can we do to grow our own wealth in our own way. But yeah, Angela, you could find me there. People can reach out to me there. I also am available to do workshops. So if anyone is interested, having me as a host, I'd love to talk in front of people. I don't think I shy away from that. But yeah, if people want to reach out, you can follow me there. And I'm excited to keep growing the Well Talks, because I do feel like we're just scratching the surface. We're just scratching the surface. And the reason I say that, there's if we look up, there's not a lot of financial resources that are available to us that look like me and you, Angela. And if I could be that resource, if people could say, hey, Pablo looks like me, I can relate to him, we come from the same background, same ideas, and I'd like to learn more about what I need to do to make sure I'm building my own wealth. So yeah, it's been great. I'm connecting with a ton of people. You were a part of the kickoff, which I love, and I know people to this day. Angela speaks super highly of you, so I'm excited to keep growing Pablo Well Talks. And I think it's just there's no ceiling for that. And to my point earlier about the whole Elon Musk, like there's no ceiling. Wherever it goes, I'm here for it. But it's all about at the end of the day, the community, and providing that education to them.
That's amazing. Well, Pablo, I want to thank you for taking the time, sharing the knowledge that you have. Really appreciate you being on the podcast, and being a partner in all things. I mean, I would say partner in crime, but just my partner in all things financial literacy. So thank you.
Absolutely, Angela. Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, and I'm sure this is hopefully gonna help people out. And if there's anything that any of your listeners just have any questions, I want them to feel comfortable with shooting me a message. But thanks again, Angela. I really appreciate you.